Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the legislature meets in a special session to pass a new law on medical marijuana. How did the compromise bill differ from the ballot initiative? Which legislators were in support? Who fought against the changes? And how are citizens reacting? 2019 will bring a big shakeup in government at all levels. What are Utah's congressional leaders doing to prepare for these changes? How will it impact cities and counties in our state? And with new budget projections, what are the priorities leading into Utah's legislative session?
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Lindsay Whitehurst, political reporter with the Associated Press, Lester Rojas, reporter and anchor with Univision, and Doug Wilks, editor of the Deseret News. So glad to have you all here with us this week. Let's jump right into some big things happening with our legislature this week. And we'll start with you, Lindsay. Our legislature met in special session to pass legislation on medical marijuana. I know you were there watching the whole proceedings. Let's talk about the politics of this first, because the vote came down pretty much along political lines with at least one difference that we'll talk about. Give us the flavor for the Hill and whether or not this was a contentious issue or not that day.
You know, there was certainly some contention, and as you mentioned, several Democrats tried to stand up and ask for the compromise to be set aside and to implement Prop 2 as passed by the voters, making the argument saying, look, it won at the ballot box. This is, the people have spoken. This is what they want as it was written. That was the argument, and of course that was voted down overwhelmingly, also along party lines. And there were the galleries were certainly full of some folks who also appeared to be advocates for medical marijuana who were also not terribly happy. There were a couple outbursts of people who made that clear, that they were not very happy with the compromise. But for the most part, it was a pretty polite proceeding that went along pretty well. You didn't see a lot of people with signs and raucous protests or anything like that. Was
it not really contentious there because it was sort of baked already going in?
I think that was part of it, and I think that you know, with things like that, the weather makes a difference, and it was cold and snowy that day, and so that does make a little bit of a difference on those things. But yeah, it was already baked. People knew what was going to happen, and they knew, and I think a lot of folks who disagreed with it knew that we've got to get to the next step.
Doug, let's talk about the people who are disagreeing, because lawsuits have already been filed. Describe what those are and what you think that the chances are of those things going forward.
Well, the lawsuit is curious. I mean, opponents are making a case that the people have spoken, don't change what the people's will, but we're a representative government, and the people on the Hill can make a legitimate choice. The legislatures, people vote for those legislators, and it's a compromise from a very diverse group. You have a medical community, you have the law enforcement community, you have supporters of medical marijuana, you have legislators, Democrats as well as Republicans, who have talked about the need to close some of the loopholes that a proposition has put in place. A proposition, once it's written, can't be changed. So you don't have the back and forth of government. California has dealt with this year after year, where they have so many propositions, they end up with bad law. So here, the proposition brought people together to have a conversation, and they really did come up with a compromise that's legitimate. I think the lawsuit is misinformed. I think it's an attack on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it is such a narrow focus on one group when there was broad support to try and reach an agreement. So it's kind of a curious lawsuit.
Yeah, Lester, let's talk about that lawsuit, because it seems like they're going after these two items that Doug was just talking about: the influence of a religious institution and maybe others having undue influence, as opposed to the substance of the bill itself.
I think what people are most outraged about is that the legislators are changing the people's voice. the fact that they already supported one thing, and now they are saying, well, you know what, you guys approved this thing, but it doesn't matter what you guys did because we're going to implement this. Now, I think that's the most heated topic right now that people is angry about, and the lawsuit it's showing that they want to defend the people's voice. Even though there's been small changes on the compromise bill, I think what people are most angry about is like they didn't respect the people's voice. And I guess there were a few changes that take away some numbers of how many pharmacies are available in some medical conditions, but I think this is something that we'll see in court. I don't know if this is going to be further. It's going to be accepted as something that is going against a constitution. I don't know.
Well, let's just help us understand this argument, right? So a proposition is passed. Let's just say, take this medical marijuana. Would the people looking at this lawsuit or anyone looking at it say, hey, this is untouchable by the legislature forevermore? Is that really the argument right there? Is that a practical way to look at this?
It's, a law is a law, whether it's passed by the voters or the lawmakers, and that's why we call them lawmakers. They make laws and they can change laws, whether they pass that law or whether the voters did. That's part of their role, and the state law actually makes it easier for legislators to change laws that have been passed by the voters. So whether you agree or disagree with what they did, it's questionable whether they were on shaky legal ground. They were probably on solid legal ground from what they did.
I think the lawsuit is gonna face a barrier because it was done legally. I mean, it was legal. The lawsuit states it was unconstitutional. That's what Hinckley, the president of the Truth, is saying. But I think it was done legally. I mean, it was done through legislation for the compromise, as Doug mentioned. So many parties coming together to draft a really well done bill. However, I don't think the lawsuit will go further because it was done right. It was legal to do.
Yeah, and I mean, this sense that this is undoing the will of the people, I think, is really incorrect. The polls showed that people were in favor of some form of medical marijuana, and the polling was, high, over 60%, 65%. But that came down as people learned more about the proposition to about 52%. It passed with barely with a majority. Okay. I do think it would have failed if this compromise wasn't reached, because there was a lot of money that was set to go to try and educate the public on this proposition, and all that was pulled back. A compromise was reached, and Utah has a kind of landmark medical marijuana law right now. Law enforcement thinks they can enforce the laws. The medical community thinks it can have some control over distribution, and people who need it, which is why people are sympathetic to this, families, children, adults can have access to marijuana. Now, the details, how it rolls out, that still needs to be worked on. But this was actually good, strong Utah effort.
It was really interesting to hear on the Hill how many lawmakers said, I think it was Senator Christensen who actually said, this is a big step for me to support this compromise, any form of medical marijuana. So there were a number of lawmakers who said that just the fact that I am voting into law medical marijuana, that's something I maybe never thought I would do. So
yeah, that's a great point. Lester, talk about that for a minute, because up until 2015 is when we started seeing some of these bills come forward, but there's not a lot of traction. Do you give credit to this proposition for getting legislators to where they are today on this?
I think we have to give a lot of credit because it's Utah, one of the most conservative states in the country, and by coming all these groups together, it gives something, at least something, to those patients that are looking for something to be done for their children, for themselves, and this is probably a platform to something else in the future. I mean, we have one of the patients, Enedina Ramos, Stanger. She had to leave Utah to go to Colorado in order for her to have her illness to be treated. And she said, you know what, there's something to be done. And she is one of the people that she supported Prop 2, but then when the compromise bill came together, she's like, you know what, I'm supporting the compromise bill. Let's do this the right way. There is different agencies. I mean, the police. Doug mentioned the police. If the police agrees with this bill, it's telling us something, that the police is going to be able to track and to control the substance. Perhaps is not the loopholes are covered, but however, the police is agreeing to this bill. So I guess it's a big step for the state.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. And Doug, let's just follow up because you brought up that point right there. So law enforcement was unitedly against the proposition, but not against this compromise bill.
Well, one of the loopholes that was changed. Previously, people could grow, if you're not within 100 miles of a dispensary, people could grow a certain number of plants in their home. And then you're driving in a car. Law enforcement had no idea, how to enforce illegal activities with marijuana and differentiate between those who legitimately have marijuana to use. The way it's administered, is it in a medicinal form? Can dispensaries be controlled? Can a pharmacist be involved? And so what Utah did is it tried to have pharmacists involved. It limited the number of licenses, from from about 7 or 10, and it has a central location which it will develop, which will be able to push medical marijuana into different locations all throughout the state. So the lawsuit's unfortunate in that this is really something to champion. This is something that other states can look at as a model. And the whole motivation for this is to try and protect teenagers and children from getting marijuana into their hands if they don't, unless they have a legitimate purpose. One thing they did was they upped the age from 18 to 20 in terms of having to get basically permission. You could argue that point, an 18-year-old is an adult. But these are all things that, to Lindsay's point, lawmakers make laws, and sometimes you go at a law and you say, oh, wow, there's unintended consequences with that. Let's alter that law. This proposition, you say yes, say no. It passed, and now you work on the law to say, okay, what's best for Utah? So this really is something to champion, which I think is important for us.
Before we leave that, Lindsay, the online petition is going on now as well. Really trying to just send a message to our legislature. Based on your conversations with many of them, are those outside kind of influences having an impact? Are those going to subside after time?
I think in a short answer, no. I think that people do pay attention to them, and I think that there are a few districts where it could make something of a difference. There are a few districts where Prop 2 passed and lawmakers supported the compromise, and maybe were even against the concept of medical marijuana in the broad scope, right? But I think there are also a lot, like Senator Hilliard was saying, how look, medical marijuana failed in my district, so he wouldn't necessarily suffer a lot of political blowback if he hadn't supported the compromise. So I think that there are a lot of other lawmakers who look to their constituents in their district and see that Prop 2 didn't pass. But I think there are a few where it could make a difference. But for the most part, I think petitions like that speak to the people who would be otherwise looking at them favorably.
Yeah. Doug, this is such an interesting point, because several legislators are saying, hey, my constituency they wanted medical marijuana, completely opposed to Prop 2, but the bulk of these voters are in the most populated parts of the state, Salt Lake County in particular. Yeah,
again, this issue, there was a wind-up to this issue, right? Years ago, the legislature wouldn't touch it. Last legislative session, they started making inroads and providing, oil to cannabis oil to be available. Now you're to a point. I do think that the proposition motivated is maybe the most polite word, motivated lawmakers to take a hard look at it, motivated the medical community to say, look, this is coming, what should we do about it? The trend across the nation, many states have legalized marijuana totally. Colorado's saying some ill effects of that. Other states surrounding Utah have legal marijuana. So to have medical marijuana, try and control it and provide the help needed, I think is strong, without hurting, unduly influencing teenagers, where you see a rise in marijuana use for undeveloped brains.
Where it could be interesting is statewide races. Statewide races like the governor's race in 2020. And then you do have all the voters in the state, including many who, the majority of people supported Prop 2. And depending how many of those people are angry and frustrated that the original language of Prop 2 didn't stay, it could potentially make a difference. I mean, it's 2 years from now, so we'll see where that issue is in 2 years, right? But I think, politically, in terms of what kind of blowback there could be, a statewide race, you could potentially see something, depending on how people feel. I mean, we'll see what happens here, right? I mean, as it's rolled out, as it happens in real life, we'll see what the effects are. I mean, maybe people will be, in 2 years, people will feel okay with it, and maybe not. Maybe in 2 years they'll still feel like frustrated.
Let's talk about what's going to happen in 2 years, because something interesting. The governor did something, released his budget this week. All right, so he's clearly not as worried about what's going to happen in 2 years, because he took a couple of controversial positions. Right, he set a budget based on some things that governors have wanted to do in the past, haven't been very successful. Doug, let's talk about a couple of those. I know you're following it closely. A couple of big items in the governor's budget, including, let's talk about something where he took a leap.
Well, I mean, he had a good leap to take, because there's a $1.3 billion budget surplus, so he has money to work with. He said he'll give $200 million back in taxes back to individuals. In the sales tax, he wants to drop the sales tax, and we heard him this week. He came into the Deseret News this week. They'd love to get that under 4% if they could. So now it's to the legislature to make the laws, but they're saying, look, we have plenty of money, let's drop the sales tax. But for years, he's wanted to make an adjustment and balance and tax the service industries, because the amount of money coming from other taxes has changed as the economy has changed. And it's taxes in the service industry that'll be the most interesting debate, because some will be popular and some will not. And he's also, of course, putting much money into education.
Yeah, so let's hit a couple of those. Lindsay, I know you were there at the press conference. So let's talk about this tax cut. This $200 million is what he's setting aside, but it's on the sales tax, but it's dropping on some, increasing on others potentially. Talk about these service industries, how they're impacted.
Yes, you're talking about a wide range of industries. The example he gave at that press conference was limousine rentals, that those kinds of things are not taxed. And then there are other things is from pest control to liposuction to even streaming services like Netflix. And so I think it's a really wide range of things, and depending on what happens, that could really sort of be a change people see for years and years to come. I mean, their argument is that the sales tax base is really dwindling, and we have got to do something. And it's a fairly persuasive argument based on the numbers they've released so far, that we are switching it all across the country, not just in Utah, from a more goods-based economy to a more service-based economy. And you have to kind of keep up with that. Otherwise, the funding's not going to be there for the government.
I agree with Lindsay. It's really persuasive change. It's a really ambitious change. $200 million. I mean, who doesn't like seeing the tax decrease? Now, I guess this proposal comes with a parallel vision. We have to switch from decreasing the tax under the 4% to spread it through services, right? But I guess this is not going to be easy for some people that like, the Netflix, or, I mean, I don't know how many people does the liposuction, is that what it's called? But, I mean, it's something that is not common.
Clearly not you.
Well, yeah. So it's going to be just a mental shift from decreasing this $200 million tax to services. People may see it, may not see it like as hard as other people see. I mean, people don't like other people's touch their pocket. But when we talk about tax decrease, I mean, we all agree with it.
So, Doug, one of the interesting points here relates to an issue you and the Deseret News have been working on. This is air quality.
Yeah.
$100 million set aside for air quality in the state. Talk about that.
Well, we asked the government about that when he came in to talk to our editorial board this week, and again, Utah has riches to put toward this, and he's trying to get incentives. So you can deal with things like wood stoves and things that actually can make a difference in air pollution. There's more than 140 days of some kind of pollution problem in Salt Lake City during the past year, dealing with ozone or particulate. We're not, Utah sometimes gets a bad rap because, they might have the worst air on a single day during the inversion in the winter. And that gets headlines, much to the frustration of the governor and others, because you say, oh, Utah has the air worse than Los Angeles or something like that. But it does occur, and we do have to make a difference. The Deseret News has been looking for solutions. What can you do immediately to try and make a difference? And a lot of it comes down to individuals, personal effort. And we're looking at motivation. We're looking at solutions. We went to Norway to see what Oslo's doing. Oslo's cut automobiles coming into Oslo by 500,000 automobiles a month. And they've done that because they've put electric cars as a priority, and they put charging stations all along the way. And they're not waiting for a grand master plan. They get a good idea, and then they do the good idea. And so some of that get a good idea executed, I think Utah can take advantage of. Is there a bike lane leading to a track station? That's, we've identified certain track stations where that's not happening. But to the governor's point, he has put money into it, and I think there is motivation to continue to provide incentives, because actually the air is getting better in Utah, which is sometimes we don't talk enough about.
Interesting. Lindsay, $300 million for public ed. I'm kind of curious how you think the legislature is going to receive that budget recommendation, maybe even in light of question number 1, where Utahns weren't willing to pay for it.
Right.
Tax.
And of course, education funding is huge, right? It's a perennial issue. We're always talking about it, and the governor is always pushing for more education funding. And I think a pitch like that is easier in a year where there's more money to play with, right? And I think with Prop 1, it was a little bit difficult, because were people voting against an education tax, or were they voting against a gas tax? You know what I mean? Is it that they didn't want to fund education, or they just didn't want to pay more money for gas? And I don't want to pay more money for gas, right? So it's a little bit difficult. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I think there are a lot of lawmakers who do believe in education, but you have to make those choices, right? Are we going to do roads, or are we going to do education? And so I think that some of that could be controversial, and the fact that proposition failed could also be ammo for folks who feel like, look, we can't put all this money into education now.
Can I just say one thing on that? I mean, it was question 1, and there's some non-binding things in that, and I think that the question wasn't written that well. And to kind of say, well, we're going to take gas tax and put it with education, I think that confused voters as well. So I don't think that's a really good measure of will people support education. The governor's putting a lot of money into education. He's parsed it in certain ways that we have new money. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was more than $400 million in new money going to education. Some of it is for teacher bonuses. Some of it is for supplies. And the local educators are going to be able to make a lot of the decisions in that. So I agree, it's a good time to be making these decisions. The question is, are you motivated to make the hard decisions in a time of plenty? Because it's easier for lawmakers to maybe sit back and say, oh, we have this money, we'll do these things, but don't bring these problems to me.
And are you going to see the people who are really excited and pushing for more education funding come back and bring that issue again to people's fore? Lowest per pupil funding in the nation, you hear a lot about it, and I think it matters when people come up and they kind of raise their voices on those things too.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest issue for me is the bonuses for the teachers. I mean, we have to face the teachers shortage on the state, and I think this is a good thing, just to send a message that, hey, there is money for teachers, not only just for the pocket, but just for a better mental health for the teacher, being rewarded for what they do, which is great. I mean, I have 3 daughters, and for me, it will be crucial for me to have a teacher that is well taken care of and that has some motivation to keep going.
Because good teachers make all the difference.
Yes.
They do indeed. Okay, let's get to a very local issue. So Ben McAdams is about to take over in our 4th Congressional District, which leaves a space open, the new Salt Lake County mayor. Doug, let's talk about a couple of candidates that have announced already. We have Jenny Wilson, Shireen Gorbani, and we think potentially on Monday, Arlen Bradshaw. Tell us what's happening in this race already and a little bit about the process.
Well, the process is in the hands of the Democratic Party. It's interesting because you have 2 high-profile candidates who were running for, federal offices. Shireen Gorbani did very well in a debate. I was at the debate, and she kind of came to the forefront to say, look, I want to serve, and she was knowledgeable. All the candidates are knowledgeable and can make a difference in Salt Lake City. I won't pretend to be an expert on all 3, nor would I offer an opinion on all 3. But I think that process will come. The Democrats, within 30 days will be able to find out who the next mayor of Salt Lake City will be.
Well, it's interesting, Lindsay. So Shireen Ghorbani, she talked about the debate. She did pretty well in that race against Chris Stewart. I mean, in terms of a newcomer, political scene, it was over 30%. I think that's pretty good for a newcomer. All right. So where do you think the issues are going to be in this particular race going forward?
Yeah, she ran a really interesting race and kind of came out of nowhere, and especially I thought her social media was really well done, and so it seems like she's kind of jumping on the momentum of what a impact she had in Salt Lake City in particular, and so this is an intra-party thing. It's not like they're going to go to the voters and have a general election. They're going to be chosen within the party, and then you have somebody like Jenny Wilson who's been around a decent amount of time. She's been on the Salt Lake County Council and really served there for a while, and of course ran against Mitt Romney, and so had her name out there that way. And so it'll kind of depend whether are you going to go with somebody you've known for a long time who has a lot of experience. You're going to go with somebody who's kind of new and interesting kid on the block a little bit, and so yeah, the party will have to kind of decide on that one, and then of course they've got to look to the next election too, and who that person will be running against in the next election.
So Lester, let's talk about Ben McAdams for just a moment. He's already making kind of a visual of what his administration is going to be like, right? He said, I'm going to be someone that's not going to be looking to oversee the Trump administration. I'm not going to be issuing subpoenas. There are things I care about. It's practical politics. How is that being received this week on Ben McAdams and what people think about him being in office?
I think what Ben McAdams did is historic in Utah. I mean, the election, having a Democrat in the White House, in Congress is great. So what people, I think many people, or a lot of people, have so many high expectations from Ben McAdams. Being an independent voice, he portrayed it on his campaign to be independent, reiterating one time and again, not supporting Pelosi and not always supporting Trump. So I think what people are expecting is to be a strong voice to stand up for what Utah values are, the 4th congressional district, and high expectations for him.
All right, Barry, this is going to have to be the last word on this one. Sorry, I know we have so much more to talk about. Thank you for your comments and insights today. That's it for this week. Please join us next Friday for another edition of the Hinckley Report. Thank you and good night.